In the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing. German forces were retreating, the Reich was burning, and across the ocean, America was already preparing for victory. But on a quiet morning in Texas, far from the roar of bombs, a bus rolled through the gates of a U.S. prisoner of war camp. Inside sat a small group of German Red Cross nurses, tired, pale, and frightened. They had been captured only weeks earlier near the crumbling front lines. Now they were being delivered into the hands of their enemies. The bus rattled across the dusty road, and the women sat in silence. Their uniforms hung loose from malnutrition, their eyes hollow. Everything they had been taught about the Americans was filled with fear. Cruelty, humiliation, revenge. They expected barbed wire, barking dogs, and beatings. Instead, when the bus doors opened, what reached them first was the smell of bacon. It drifted through the morning air, thick, warm, almost unreal. The scent of frying bacon, melting butter, and brewing coffee. One of the nurses, her voice barely a whisper, muttered, "Fleisch, meat." Her companion almost laughed, a sound halfway between disbelief and despair. "Impossible," she said. Back home in Germany, meat had become a ghost. Bread was stretched with sawdust. Soups were made from scraps. Children no longer remembered the taste of pork. And yet here, in what they believed was a prison, breakfast smelled like home. When the guards ordered them off the bus, the women stepped onto gravel, blinking against the Texas sunrise, a soft orange sky above endless open land. They expected shouts. They expected rifles aimed at their heads. But the American soldiers were calm, their commands brief and efficient. No one screamed. No one hit them. One of the guards gestured toward the mess hall, where smoke curled lazily from a chimney. They saw cooks cracking eggs, pouring coffee, as if the war didn't exist. Then came a voice that made every German nurse freeze. "Coffee?" it asked, spoken in English but kind. The voice belonged not to a guard, but to another nurse, an American. She wore a crisp uniform, her posture confident. And what struck the German women most, she was black. In Germany, they had been told endless lies about race, about inferiority, about who was fit to serve. Yet here she was, offering them tin mugs of hot coffee without anger, without mockery. Just a question. "Would you like some?" The Germans didn't know how to respond. One whispered, "Danke." Another hesitated before taking the mug, her hands trembling. The coffee was bitter, strong, alive. And in that moment, in that small act of ordinary kindness, something inside them cracked. The fear didn't vanish, but it softened. These weren't the monsters they had been told to expect. The women were processed quickly, names recorded, belongings listed, new linens folded neatly into their arms. They were told they could write home. Their letters would be read first, of course, but they could write. The bunks were clean, the quarters orderly. Not comfortable, but not cruel either. It was as if they had stepped into a strange version of war that didn't quite make sense. When breakfast came, reality struck harder than ever. Eggs, bread, coffee, and between two women on the same tray, a single strip of bacon. The smell filled the room. One nurse stared at it for a long time before whispering, "Is this allowed?" The other only nodded. Hunger won. They took small bites at first, slow, cautious, and then faster. The taste was too real, too heavy with memory. For a moment, they were not prisoners. They were simply women remembering a Sunday morning before the war, when life still had warmth. That breakfast became a story they repeated again and again. Because even though the barbed wire was real, So was the smell of bacon, and that made captivity feel like something they couldn't quite name. In the days that followed, the camp's rhythm took hold. The nurses expected hardship. Instead, they found structure, order. Mornings began not with punishment, but with the call for breakfast. The smell of coffee, bread, and frying potatoes filled the mess hall. One of the nurses, Erica, whispered to another, "They can't keep this up forever. They'll take it away when we get used to it." But morning after morning, it never changed. The food came. The guards stayed calm. The camp ran like a machine of quiet discipline. They were prisoners, but treated like people. The biggest shock came not from the food, but from the work. Within a week, the nurses were assigned to assist in the camp infirmary. They expected a bare, improvised hospital, a few beds and bandages. What they found instead left them speechless. Shelves filled with medical supplies, bottles of disinfectant, rolls of clean gauze, and in a refrigerated cabinet, vials of penicillin. In Germany, penicillin was a myth, something reserved for the highest-ranking officers, hoarded like gold. Here it sat in neat rows, available for anyone who needed it. "My God," Hilda whispered. "They have more here than we had for an entire division." The American staff, doctors and nurses, men and women, worked efficiently. They didn't gloat. They didn't mock. They simply told the German nurses where to help: change sheets, clean instruments, wash hands. The routine was ordinary, and that made it extraordinary. One American nurse, tall and auburn-haired, noticed their astonishment. "Here," she said, handing them a box of bandages. "No shortages. No excuses." Her tone was firm, not cruel, and that made it even harder to understand. As days passed, the German nurses began to see the truth. America had not only won the war of soldiers, it had won the war of resources. Factories still ran. Medicine was plentiful. Food seemed endless. Everywhere the women looked, they saw abundance, something they hadn't seen in years. At night, lying in their bunks, they whispered about it. "How can they have so much?" Marta asked. "Maybe they want us to see it," Erica replied. "Maybe it's a trick." But even she sounded uncertain, because the bacon was real, the coffee was real, and so was the kindness. Quiet, consistent, confusing. What the women didn't realize was that they were witnessing a part of America few outsiders ever saw: the power of discipline, the strength of supply, and the strange mercy that came with victory. For these nurses, captivity in Texas would not break them. It would change them forever. Weeks passed in the Texas heat. The German Red Cross nurses began to settle into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Each morning, they lined up for roll call, their uniforms freshly washed and neatly folded, courtesy of the same guards who had captured them. Beyond the fence, open plains stretched endlessly, dotted with mesquite and dust. Crows circled in the hot sky. Somewhere far away, the sound of a train echoed, a reminder that the world outside still moved, even if theirs had stopped. At first, the women counted the days, but soon the days lost their shape. There was no bombing, no air raid sirens, no frantic surgeries in candlelight. Instead, there was something none of them expected: quiet. Inside the camp hospital, life took on a strange routine. American medics worked alongside the German nurses, teaching them procedures they had never seen. They demonstrated how to sterilize instruments properly, how to use sulfa powder to prevent infections, how to inject penicillin. To the German women, it was like stepping a decade into the future. "You treat even prisoners with this?" Hilda asked one day, holding up a vial of penicillin. The American doctor, a middle-aged man with silver hair and calm eyes, looked at her as if the question itself were strange. "We treat everyone," he said. "That's the point." The answer struck her harder than any weapon could. For years, the nurses had been told that medicine was for the strong, the pure, the deserving. But here, even captured soldiers received the same care as Americans. Wounded Germans, British, even Italians lay side by side, each treated with the same respect. It was not weakness, it was power. The power to choose mercy when you didn't have to. In the evenings, after their work ended, the women returned to their barracks. Sometimes they sang softly in German, their voices blending with the hum of cicadas outside. Other times, they simply sat in silence, staring at the fading sunset that painted the barbed wire gold. The guards didn't interfere. Some even nodded politely as they passed, hats tilted, rifles slung lazily over their shoulders. There were no beatings, no screams, just discipline, quiet, absolute. One night, as the sky turned violet, a young American soldier approached the fence with a wooden crate. Inside were books, some in English, some in German. "For you," he said awkwardly, pushing them through the wire. "Keeps the mind busy." The nurses blinked in disbelief. Books, paper, ink. Things that had vanished long before Germany collapsed. Among them was a worn copy of Gone with the Wind, its corners curled, its pages yellow. The women took turns reading it, using a candle stub for light. The story of survival, pride, and loss in a broken world resonated deeply with them. For the first time, they began to understand something about the people who had defeated them. War, it seemed, didn't just destroy nations, it revealed character. Days turned into weeks, and small details began to change. The nurses stopped flinching at every loud noise. They began greeting the guards in hesitant English. Some even smiled, not from happiness, but from relief. Then, one afternoon, something unexpected happened. An American officer entered the infirmary with a German prisoner on a stretcher, a young man, his face pale and twisted in pain. The nurses recognized his uniform instantly. He was from the same division they had served in before capture. The officer placed the stretcher down and said, "He's yours. Treat him." The women worked quickly, instinct taking over. They cleaned his wounds, stitched his leg, whispered encouragement in their mother tongue. When they finally stabilized him, they looked up and saw the American doctor watching quietly from the doorway. He nodded once. "Good work," he said simply. For the first time since their capture, the German nurses felt something strange. Pride. Not in their nation, not in their flag, but in their craft. In that room, surrounded by enemies, they were no longer victims of war. They were healers again. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Erica, the oldest of them, sat by the fence, lost in thought. A guard approached and asked if she was all right. "I am thinking," she said slowly, "about how strange it is to be treated kindly by the people we were told to hate." The guard looked at her for a long time. Then he said something that would stay with her forever. "Hate doesn't build anything, ma'am. It only burns." That night, the camp was silent except for the wind rustling through the wires. For the German nurses, the realization began to settle in, that perhaps the greatest strength was not dominance, but restraint. But war was never far away. One morning, a truck arrived at the camp gates carrying fresh prisoners, men who had been captured in Europe only weeks before. They were thin, wild-eyed, defiant. When they saw the German nurses working calmly with Americans, they spat at them. "Traitors!" one shouted, "working for the enemy!" The women said nothing. They simply turned back to their work. That moment cut deep. A reminder that peace could be as painful as war, because survival required more than strength. It required humility and acceptance that the world they once knew was gone. Over the next months, small privileges appeared. The nurses were allowed to walk in groups near the perimeter, to attend Sunday service, even to play music on an old radio. Every act of freedom, no matter how small, felt like a miracle. The Americans didn't grant these privileges because of pity, but because of principle. To them, discipline was not about cruelty. It was about order, and order meant fairness. One evening, a storm rolled across Texas. Lightning splitting the sky, thunder shaking the earth. The nurses huddled in their barracks, terrified that the roof might collapse. But through the howling wind, they heard something remarkable: laughter. Outside, American guards were running through the rain, drenched, joking, shouting, helping each other tie down tents. It wasn't the laughter of conquerors. It was the laughter of men who had survived too much and learned to live again. And somehow, that laughter gave the nurses comfort. By morning, the camp was calm again. The sun rose clean and sharp, steam rising from the wet earth. One of the women, Hilda, stepped outside and whispered, "Maybe captivity is not a punishment. Maybe it's a lesson." Winter came slowly to Texas. The wind grew colder, the nights longer, and frost began to settle on the wire fences that surrounded the camp. Inside, the German Red Cross nurses continued their daily routines: cleaning, tending, learning. Yet there was something different in the air, a kind of stillness, like a clock winding down. Rumors began to spread. The war in Europe was ending. Germany was collapsing, and Allied forces were closing in from every side. The prisoners whispered it at night, some in disbelief, others in fear. What would happen to them when their country was gone? One morning, the camp commander, a tall man with a calm voice, assembled the nurses outside. His words were brief but carried a weight that silenced everyone. "The war," he said, "is over." The women stood frozen. For a moment, none of them knew whether to cry or cheer. Then, slowly, the realization sank in. The world they had known no longer existed. Their home cities were rubble, their families scattered, their uniforms meaningless. They were free, yes. But free to go where? That night, the barracks were filled with whispers. Some women wept quietly into their blankets. Others sat staring into the distance, trying to imagine what a world without orders, salutes, and flags might look like. Freedom, they realized, was not the same as peace. A few days later, the Americans gathered them in the mess hall. Tables had been cleared, chairs arranged neatly. The same officer who had once guarded them now stood before them with a different tone, not command, but compassion. "You'll be repatriated soon," he said. "But before you leave, we want you to know something." He paused, searching for the right words. "You came here as enemies. You're leaving as human beings. You've worked hard, you've shown courage, and most of all, you've shown that mercy can survive even in the middle of war." No one moved. Some women lowered their eyes. Others bit their lips, holding back tears. Then, from the back, one nurse, Erica, stood up. Her voice trembled, but her words were clear. "We came here afraid," she said softly. "But you taught us something we didn't expect, that strength is not in punishment, but in kindness." We will remember there was silence. Even the guards seemed to stand a little straighter. The next morning, buses arrived to take them to the port. The nurses packed their few belongings: a comb, a book, a piece of cloth, a photograph. The barracks that had once felt like a cage now looked strangely like home. They stepped onto the buses in silence, their eyes scanning the camp one last time. The wire, the watchtowers, the open Texas sky that had witnessed their transformation. As the buses rolled out, the guards saluted, not mockingly, but respectfully. On the road to Galveston, the women watched the landscape blur past. Fields of gold, rivers glinting in the sunlight, towns with white church steeples and waving flags. They were leaving behind the land of their captors, yet part of them knew they would never forget it. When they reached the port, American soldiers handed them small paper packets, letters of health, new shoes, and rations for the journey home. It was more than they had expected, and when the ship finally pulled away, they stood on deck, staring at the fading coastline of America, a place that had been their prison and their teacher. The sea was endless. For weeks they sailed toward a homeland they no longer recognized. When they arrived in Europe, the sight was almost unbearable. Cities reduced to ashes, children begging on street corners, no flags, no order, only survival. The nurses walked through what was left of their country, ghosts among ruins. But something inside them had changed. Where others saw only defeat, they saw possibility. Where others wanted revenge, they wanted healing. They joined the effort to rebuild hospitals, schools, and orphanages. Their skills, sharpened in captivity, became invaluable. They taught younger nurses what they had learned in Texas: hygiene, discipline, and above all, humanity. In Berlin, one of them, Hilda, opened a small clinic in the ruins of an old government building. Her first patients were not soldiers or officers, but children. When asked why she chose this path, she simply said, "Because someone once showed me mercy when I didn't deserve it." Word spread about the nurses of Texas, the German women who had been prisoners yet returned home carrying compassion instead of hatred. Their story became a quiet legend, told in whispers during long winter nights. Years later, when one of the American officers visited Europe as part of a diplomatic mission, he was invited to that same clinic. An older woman greeted him with a smile. "Do you remember me?" she asked. He squinted. Then his eyes widened. It was Erica. Her hair was gray now, but her presence carried the same quiet dignity. She led him through the ward, showing him the patients, the children, the charts, everything rebuilt from nothing. At the end of the tour, she turned to him and said, "You see, Captain, your camp did not end when we left. It lives here, in every life we save." The man smiled softly, unable to speak. Outside, the sky over Berlin was blue again, the first clear spring in decades. War does not always end with silence. Sometimes it ends with a whisper, the sound of compassion crossing enemy lines. These women, once defined by the borders of their nation, discovered a truth far greater than victory or defeat: that even in the darkest corners of war, the human heart can still choose light. Because the greatest battles are not fought with guns, they are fought with conscience.